All right, let's take a look at another sign here. And I'm going to start this video off by explaining the meaning of this word here down at the end of the sentence. The base form of this verb would be 시작되다. And one thing I want to do is sort of compare the difference between 시작되다 and 시작하다. Now, in lesson 14, I talk about the difference between passive verbs. And one way that you can tell a passive verb is if the end of it ends in teda, which you see here, and active verbs. And not always, but usually, if there's a verb that ends in hada, the passive equivalent of that verb would be if you just replaced hada with teda. So that's what we see here, and I want to just briefly explain when you would use 시작되다 instead of 시작하다. Now, 시작하다, because it's an active verb, you would use this if you want to say that somebody or something starts doing a particular thing. So for example, if I wanted to say, I start work, or I start studying, or studies, or studying, or whatever you want to say, in that case, because you have a subject, you have in both cases a subject doing a verb, and the verb is in both cases work, and studying is actually a noun, even though they kind of look like verbs in this case, because to study and to work are verbs. But in this case, the noun of work and the noun of studying, in both cases, you're starting those things. Now, in Korean, if I wanted to talk about what I start work would be, it would be 나는, and that would be the informal way to say it. And then work is 일. And then that's the object of the sentence, or in other words, that's the thing that I'm starting. So I would want to put the object particle onto that. And then what I would do is I would put 시작하다. And I'll just conjugate this into the plain form, just because I want to do it as just a basic, simple conjugation here. But in this case, what I have is I start work, or I start my work, or I start the work, or something like that. Now, in this case, because I have a subject actively doing a verb onto an object, I need to use this active form of the verb. However, you would use 시작되다 when there's times when some sort of inanimate object or something that doesn't really have free will, when something like that, it's not being started by something. Instead, what's happening is that it, and I'll just put it in brackets because it could be sort of any inanimate object, it starts. Some sort of thing starts. Who started it? When did it start? Well, I don't know any of that stuff. I just know that something starts. One example that I talked about actually in my lesson 14 sentence practice video is I made a sentence where I wanted people like you who are listening to this right now to translate the sentence, our love starts. And in this case, because our love is the subject of the sentence, but the subject of the sentence is not starting something, this is some sort of inanimate object that happens to just start. And it's not somebody starting some sort of noun like work or studying or something like that. It's some sort of inanimate object or some sort of thing or some sort of idea that just starts. Now, in this case, because here I'm using teda, and again, this is 시작되다, but this little ending here is just the formal conjugation of adding this to 시작되다, and when that happens, you get 시작됩니다. But what I know already is that something starts. Okay, well, let's look at the rest of the sign to see what it is that is starting. Now, this word here, 이, that just means this, and it's a very, very simple word, that both in English and in Korean. It refers to this of whatever is going on here. Now, 지점 is a really interesting word for me, and I have the Hanja for 지점 right here. It's interesting because this word translates to point. But point in English can translate or can mean many, many different things. Are you talking about the action of pointing? Are you talking about, a point as in like a little point, like a dot on a map or a point on a map? What point are you talking about? There's many different, are you talking about some sort of spiky point like this? What are you talking about here? Well, that's why it's really cool to learn Hanja, because you can sort of understand maybe the meaning of what type of point I'm referring to if you just sort of know the Hanja between these two. Well, this one here, this is actually the point, that this sort of always translates to point. But again, what point are we talking about? Well, if you know the Hanja for G, and this is the Hanja for G. If any of you know your Hanja characters, if maybe you might know this from Chinese or something like this, this refers to some sort of land. And what this is referring to, this jijam, it's referring to some sort of point on the ground or some sort of point on the land or something like that. So if I know that this means point, and again, don't just translate it to point, it translates to some sort of point on, a land or some sort of point on the ground or something like that. Buta here, this is a particle that gets added to, in this case, a place to indicate that it's from that particular point. So what I know right now is from this, and that's what Eve means again, from this point, and oh great, I already know the final part, from this point, something starts. And I know that there cannot be an object in this sentence, or in other words, I'm going to just use another color here for a second. I can't see and I won't see this type of object particle. I won't see this or this in this sentence because I have a passive verb and it won't be able to act on an object. And if you look at the sign that I have here, that's true. Maybe I'll keep this color because that is sort of drawing on a blue and you can't really see it very well. If you look at this sentence, that's true. I actually don't see these object particles anywhere because you can't use 시작되다 to act on an object, so you won't end up seeing these things. Okay, so now I just know from this point, something starts. Well, what's starting here? Now it's just a matter of translating the words that are on the sign. One of the things that I always think would be difficult for a beginner learning how to speak Korean is if they see this big mash of syllables here, they might think, whoa, that's a big word. Where does one thing start and the next thing end? Or where does one thing end and the next thing start? Well, there should be spaces here, and I'll tell you where the spaces are. There should be a space here, there should be a space here, and that's a particle that should be attached to this. But sometimes on signs, they sort of mash all these things together, especially if they all sort of contribute to one big idea, which is what this is talking about here. 낚시, that means fishing. If you've been following my sign videos, you probably know the meaning of this noun. This is a noun that's typically put in sign videos basically to say that you can't do something or you're not allowed to do something or something is prohibited. Or in other words, I'll just write not allowed. Not allowed. And then 구역 is another thing that you probably have seen if you've been following my sign videos. This is just basically indicating the area or some sort of designated area that where something is allowed or something is not allowed or something like that. And if you put this, again, it looks like one word, but it really is three words that come together just to make one idea. What it is a fishing not allowed area. Or I'm trying to think about how I might translate that into plain English. It's an area where fishing is prohibited, or I guess you could just say fishing not allowed area, but that doesn't sound perfectly natural. Okay, great. Now we know the whole sign. This whole sign translates to, from this particular point, and it's not a point as in a point like that, like a pointy thing, but from this particular point on the ground or on the land, the area of fishing not being allowed starts. And oh great, look, this is the arrow. From what point? Well, from this point here, let's say this is where I'm standing. From this point until and on, that's when this not allowed area for fishing or the fishing not allowed area starts. Well, that was fun. I hope you learned a lot.